Hello, everyone. I'm Burton Glass, Director of Marketing and Communication at Boston University's College of Communication. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, Saving Local Journalism. Today's event is part of our series of virtual events we call COMTalks, featuring topics and experts in advertising, film, journalism, media science, public relations, and television. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to watch later online at COM's YouTube channel. Today's conversation starts with the assumption that the business model that sustained hometown newspapers is broken, and the local news outlets are disappearing at an alarming rate. The result, a worrisome decline in government accountability, voter participation, and even social cohesion. Solutions have proven elusive, but some journalists, entrepreneurs, and researchers see hope in new approaches. Well, we've assembled an all-star panel with some of those very people to help us understand that challenge and consider solutions for saving local journalism in this country. Let me introduce them. First, we have Sarabeth Berman. She is CEO of the American Journalism Project, the first venture philanthropy dedicated to local news. AJP invests in and builds nonprofit local news organizations across the country. Since launching in 2019, AJP has committed to more than $55 million to 44 nonprofit local news organizations and raised $168 million for local news, including nearly $60 million in local markets. Sarabeth joined AJP in 2020 as the organization's first CEO. Previously, she was Global Head of Public Affairs at Teach for All. Sarabeth is based in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us. Dan Kennedy is a professor of journalism at Northeastern University, which here at BU is very difficult because of the recent hockey beanpot loss, but we're going to still accept Dan on this one. They have a good hockey squad. But he's here more as a nationally known media commentator and the author with Ellen Clegg of the new book, What Works in Community News, Media Startups, News Deserts, and the Future of the Fourth Estate. His blog, Media Nation, is a must-read for people following the world of journalism and can be found at dankennedy.net. Thank you, Dan, for joining us.
Thank you.
Daniela Melo is a co-founder and chair of the board of the New Bedford Light, nonprofit and nonpartisan digital news outlet dedicated to coverage of important local news, and notably, in my mind, one of the most successful ones on the growing scene of news outlets. She is a political scientist and lecturer in the Division of Social Sciences at the College of General Studies here at Boston University. She has two upcoming books, one on the imprint of social movements on Portuguese democracy, the other on radical journalist Wilfred Burchett and his books on the Portuguese Revolution. She's also a frequent analyst on Portuguese national media. Welcome. Karen Rundlet is the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Nonprofit News, or INN. INN supports a network of more than 425 independent nonprofit news organizations across North America, ranging in size of one person to more than 150 staffers and covering issues from the hyperlocal to the global. Karen began her career as a journalist and worked in radio, television, and digital news. She was previously a senior director of journalism programs at the Knight Foundation. Karen lives in Miami. Karen, welcome.
Thank you.
To bring all this together, we've asked Brian McGrory, our own chair of the journalism department here at Boston University's College of Communication. Brian is probably best known, though, as the former editor of the Boston Globe during a period when the newspaper won 3 Pulitzer Prizes and was a finalist another dozen times. Globe also amassed more than 240,000 digital-only subscribers, making it an industry leader in a growing newsroom. It's very notable these days. He has authored 5 books and serves on the boards of the Baltimore Banner, the News Leaders Association, and the World Editors Forum. I'm going to close my camera now. I'm glad you're all here to hear this conversation. I'm going to turn things over to Brian.
Thank you so much, Bert. I appreciate all of those warm introductions. Thank you for the larger than normal audience for this, for taking the time out to hear about a topic, really a crisis that is as important as this. Thank you to an unusually esteemed panel of guests here. I'll also add just ahead of time, because you're all wondering, if anybody needs interior design advice, I am willing to share my designer with you. They're somewhat minimalist, but they're inexpensive. So we can, we're more than ready to do that. So I want to start out by painting a little bit of a picture of where we are in the industry right now. Already in January, the LA Times, one of the premier papers in America, news organizations in America, laid off 115 staffers. Time Magazine cut 15% of its staff. Condé Nast has had significant layoffs. The Wall Street Journal cut a very big portion of its Washington bureau. Sports Illustrated basically went down to almost nothing. This after a very grim 2023 in which the Washington Post offered buyouts to some 240 people. There were layoffs and other cuts at Vox, Vice, NBC, NPR, Texas Tribune, Business Insider. There's almost no pattern to the kind of places that are being forced to cut. We're now almost 20 years into what we've all known as a contraction of national and local media, and yet this past stretch has seemed particularly grim. So I'm going to ask you guys to set the stage here. Why is this happening so late in the game? Why haven't we figured this out yet? And most important to start with, what's causing this absolute mayhem right now in the news media? Anybody jump in and start? You're being polite.
All right, I'll jump in for you.
Okay, no more politeness.
It's been a very grim period, and it is the outgrowth of a dynamic that has been playing out over the last 2 decades, where we've watched the slow motion decline of largely the local news industry, although it's also having big impact on big national news organizations as well. But the biggest impact has played out at the local level, where thousands of communities no longer have local news. Papers have shuttered. The latest News Desert report said that on average, we are losing 2.5 papers a week. And this is a dynamic that's playing out, to put simply, because the rise of the internet fundamentally undermined the business model that had worked for a very long time, which was by and large an advertising business model. So about 80% of newspapers were funded by advertising revenue. The other 20% was subscriptions. The advertising revenue has largely dried up, and newspapers have really struggled to find a business model, a market-driven business model that will fund original journalism. And the only thing I'll add to that is, beyond the really depressing cuts and the 60% of journalists that have lost their jobs in the last 2 decades, there's also really clear evidence that the decline of local news is having very insidious implications on our democracy and on the health of communities. So political scientists have looked at this closely and found that the decline of local news is contributing to the rise in polarization. People are less likely to vote or engage in public life in communities that don't have a local paper. Corporate crime goes up, government waste goes up, taxes goes up. There's a lot of bad outcomes that are happening as a result of the market failure. So the past couple of months, we are seeing this dynamic continue to play out. But unfortunately, this has been underway for a while now.
Thank you for that. That's a great answer. That's the frustrating part. It's been underway for so long. You'd think we would in some way start to figure things out by now. And I know there are signs of hope and we are going to get to them. Dan, weigh in here. Why haven't we figured stuff out yet?
Well, I think we figured out a lot at the local level, and I was really struck by the list of places that have had major layoffs that you were uh, ticking off, because um, I think we all know that these news organizations have very little in common in some ways. The Washington Post just simply never quite figured out how to adjust to Trump leaving the White House. The Los Angeles Times, unfortunately, may have a feckless and irresponsible owner. We were hoping that was not the case, but that seems to be happening. Some of this is venture capital funded. The venture capitalists wanted their money back, and so that was kind of the end of that. My interest is really at the local and regional level. And although there have certainly been some problems here and there, we've also seen the founding of hundreds of local and regional news organizations over the past 10 to 15 years. And that's something that's really been accelerating in recent years. One of the guiding principles that Ellen Clegg and I are following in our book is that even though the Craigslist-led hollowing out of classified ads is very real, even though the rise of Google and Facebook taking away ad money is very real, um, we sometimes tend to overlook the reality that many of our nation's most important local, weekly, small daily newspapers have been completely hollowed out by corporate chains and hedge fund owners who um, are not cutting in order to lower their losses. They're cutting to bulk up profits, and those profits are being used in order to pay down debt and enrich the ownership. And so what we see with local news startups, and I will say many of them are nonprofit, but there were for-profit startups as well. They're operating without debt. They are dedicated to serving their communities, and many of them are doing very well. And if we go back a couple of generations, and you look at back when a lot of these communities were served by newspapers that were independently owned, no one was getting wealthy. So the fact that the current generation of news entrepreneurs are also not getting wealthy is really not that much to be concerned about, as long as they're able to make a living wage, pay their journalists a living wage, and provide their communities with the news and information that they need.
Thank you for that. I'm not quite ready for the hope portion of our program yet. I was hoping to wallow a bit in the crisis and create a narrative arc so that we can all end in a good place. But you guys have cut right to hope, which is really, really great. Karen, let back up a little bit. Describe what INN does. And I'd like to hear the same from Sarabeth.
Absolutely. INN was founded by investigative journalists and news organization leaders. And so it was 27 of them. They were concerned about this and they founded an organization. But today, we basically help news organizations increase their audiences, increase their revenues, often through fundraising, but not exclusively, and save them money in a number of different ways. Everything from maybe helping them negotiate affordable benefits, health benefits, to today, for instance, we announced a partnership that allows them to, any organization, INN member at a certain budget level can have free access to AP's election calls, and they don't have to pay for that. That's an expense they don't have to put out. So that's basically what INN does. And it's the members saying what they need. It's over 400 of them explaining what they need, and we work to get them services, tools, and training.
Great. Great. Thank you. Sarabeth, tell us about your organization. How is that different than INN?
Sure. So I described the dark last 2 decades that have been underway, but at the same time, as Dan mentioned, over the past decade plus, there's been this emerging industry of news organizations that are really reimagining how we sustain local news in this country. They are offering these organizations as public goods and sustaining them in that way as nonprofit news organizations that they fund through a variety of revenue streams. Philanthropy is one, reader revenue, advertising revenue. And we've watched this industry grow, but it has not been growing on the same pace that the commercial industry has been declining. So the American Journalism Project was founded to accelerate the growth of that field. And we're doing that in a few ways. One is funding existing nonprofit news organizations to help them grow. And we match our funding with very intensive hands-on strategic planning and capacity building support to help these organizations build out the revenue teams they need to sustain themselves over the long term. And then we also seed and launch new news organizations across the country. So we now have about 45 organizations everywhere from Puerto Rico to Montana to Mississippi to Vermont. And we're laser focused on helping these organizations grow their revenue, diversify their revenue, and ultimately hire more journalists to replace what's been lost from the decline of commercial newspapers across the country.
Great. So, Daniela, am I wrong here, or are we in a particularly important moment as far as nonprofit news goes? It feels like a lot of attention has shifted in the industry to the rise of nonprofits and the potential impact that they can have. I mean, it took you guys about 30 seconds to shift from the grimness of the industry to the hope of what might happen with nonprofit news. So what is this moment? Walk us through that a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was nodding at a lot of what I was hearing because I don't come from the world of journalism. So I didn't come with this insider knowledge, right, about what was happening in the industry, but very quickly got caught up quite obviously in trying to help launch the New Bedford Light with the group of other New Bedford citizens who came together for that particular effort. And a lot of what was narrated here, you can see in New Bedford. I mean, New Bedford has a historical newspaper, the Standard Times, that is still in place. So we didn't fill a complete vacuum when it comes to local news when we came. And we looked at what the Standard Times was still producing. And I say still producing because from its heyday, the Standard Times now is very much a hollowed out paper. It has gone through the same process that we've seen across the United States and left a major city in Massachusetts with a very important port in this country, a very diverse community without any almost investigative journalism, and without much access to real news about what's happening in the community. We decided our approach early on was that we were going to complement what was already in existence with the Standard Times, but really feel that gap that we sensed in our community. And I have to say, the positive spin here is we get phone calls every week from various parts of the country asking how did you do this? You know, what is your financial model? How did you get started? Where did you get your seed money? I mean, all of these questions are coming at us, and we ourselves, we did that. Like when we as a group were trying to figure out what we wanted to do, I mean, we sat with people like the founder of the Vermont Digger sat on Zoom over COVID during the COVID area, and you know, just asked them to let us pick your brain about how you did that in Vermont, and you know, how can we apply your lessons, but to our very specific context of New Bedford, right? So I think for us, it was really important to a couple of things, is that we understood that there was a hunger for more information about our institutions in our city. We hoped, because we didn't have any real data, we hoped that that hunger was not just felt by a minority of people in the city, that there would be a responsiveness. But to be pretty honest, we have no money to run any serious study on whether the community wanted or needed this. So we just had to decide to do it. And I emphasize this about New Bedford because, you know, New Bedford is an extraordinary place that often doesn't get its due, I think. But New Bedford is also unusual in this new way, or the New Bedford Light is unusual in this new wave of nonprofits. Why? Because they're coming primarily from, I mean, these types of efforts are coming primarily, at least that's my sense, please correct me if you have data otherwise, they're coming from wealthier towns, from wealthier places, from wider places, right? New Bedford is not that. New Bedford is a place where we didn't know whether people were going to donate those $5 every month, right, to help sustain a nonprofit model. It was a great test, but it made us all the more proud, right, of how far the New Bedford Light has managed to achieve and reach across the various communities within New Bedford, including linguistic communities of New Bedford, to be read at the rate that we're being read 2.5 years in. I don't know if I'm veering too far away from your question, but if you want to recenter me, please do.
No, this is very helpful. And New Bedford is one of the great examples, really, in the entire country of success on this front. And Karen, I want to get to you about some of the data on this in a moment, but stepping back a little bit, with initiatives like Press Forward and other broader attempts to get funding to, the New Bedfords and the smaller organizations of the world, those who've been in this side of the industry, the nonprofit side of the industry, this is a significant moment right now, isn't it? I mean, aren't we seeing stuff we haven't seen in many, many years?
The industry is growing tremendously. So in 2010, there were, I think, less than 50 INN members. In 2015, there was about 100. They now have over 400 members. So, and not all of them are local, but a lot of them are, and most of the growth is happening at the local level. So undoubtedly, there are more organizations coming online. And there are a lot more funders coming into the space. You mentioned Press Forward. We've been involved in several significant efforts. Last year, we announced a big project in Indiana. We had $10 million of local funding. In Wichita, several years ago, they committed several $1 million to local news. We are seeing in Ohio, several millions of dollars to local news there. We are seeing more funders into the space and more nonprofit news organizations emerging. And I think some of it is a recognition that the market's not going to solve this. I think for a long time, people were hoping that the market would find a way, that AOL would launch Patch and that would work, and we would figure out a way to get local news to communities. And I think people are very clear that the market does not seem to be resolving this at a systemic level, and that the implications of not having it are significant. And when the country doesn't have a market solution, we have a few solutions in our toolbox, one of which is philanthropy, one of which is public dollars, and a nonprofit model allows you to capture philanthropic dollars and also allows you to drive any profit back into the mission and not have to and not have to take financial gains as the financial institutions that own organizations.
Let's be clear though, nonprofits, just the fact that a news organization is a nonprofit,
not a silver bullet.
That is not by any measure a silver bullet. I remember 10 years ago, we'd, larger organizations, more metropolitan newspapers, you'd have owners talking about taking them nonprofit as if that was some magical answer to all the problems. The bottom line is a nonprofit still needs revenue. Revenue comes from readers, whether it's subscribers or the advertising that follows readers or the events that they might attend. What a nonprofit does is open the door to more philanthropy, but even philanthropy can be a very fickle aspect of what we do, right?
That's absolutely true. I'd love to kind of just speak about that a bit. I will say that INN, so first of all, we have a really excellent research and impact tool called the INN Index. It's well known in the field. And it really actually shows that in the last year, about 80% of the outlets that were a part of the index grew or maintained their revenue, and now their revenue, less than 50% of it comes from philanthropy. So they are looking at sponsorships, they are looking at advertising, they are looking at individual donors. So it's not exclusively foundation grants. They are diversifying their revenue. Now that takes time. And I do want to say, American Journalism Project and the Institute for Nonprofit News, we're partners in this work. We're allies in this work to strengthen this field. We want the same thing for the field, but it's not fully sturdy yet. And that's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to make these organizations sturdy and long lasting for the long term for our communities and for democracy.
Great, thank you. Let me float a theory, and this again falls under the category of trying to hold off hope for a little bit, which we will get to. But again, we're in this big moment. The Press Forward is, for those who don't know, is basically a $500 million initiative, right? Driven in no small way by the MacArthur Foundation and Knight and other big ticket foundations. The goal is to distribute anywhere between $500 million and $1 billion to news organizations around the country in help of creating sustainability. What if we do this, Dan? What if we do this and 3 years from now, most places haven't been able to prove the case for sustainability? Do big ticket funders, philanthropists say, I'm not going to throw money down a black hole anymore?
I think that the rise of Press Forward and some of these larger efforts are creating a lot of excitement, but they're also creating some consternation out there. I mean, what AJP and INN are doing is foundational, and certainly Ellen and I heard wherever we went that that INN's Newsmatch program was absolutely essential to what they were doing. The problem is that big money often tends to go to some of the larger regional projects, and some of the really small projects are wondering where they're going to get their money. I also have heard from a founder of a small nonprofit news startup that he was afraid that potential funders in his community might say, well, look at Press Forward, look at all these other projects. You're taken care of. You don't need to get money at the local level anymore. It seems to me that what we really need, at least in nonprofits, I think for-profits are still important as well, but in the nonprofit world, I think that the vast majority of your funding has got to come locally. Local philanthropic interests need to understand the value of supporting news in their community, just as they support youth programs, music programs, and things like that. And the big national money that we're talking about really only ought to be used as a supplement to what's taking place at the local level. When you say that maybe after 3 years it's just going to be a bust, well, I hope that these large efforts like Press Forward are taking, and I suspect that they are taking a good hard look at what is being started at the local level. And if they're saying, well, this project is being started on a wing and a prayer because they think they can get some of our money. And once they get it, they'll figure out whether they can do something good with it or not. The standard has to be higher than that, and I suspect it will be.
So when you talk about generating more money at the local level, let's go to the kind of third rail of paywalls. And it's a big issue in the nonprofit industry. Should places be charging readers for journalism? And let's all accept journalism is an incredibly expensive endeavor. Reporters, photographers, editors, they're expensive, even when we don't pay them enough, which we rarely do. What is the view here on this panel of paywalls for nonprofit initiatives? Because an initiative is nonprofit or taking philanthropic dollars, does that mean you're reticent about charging people to read you?
Can I jump in on this one? Yeah.
Yes, and you don't have a paywall, right, Daniela?
No,
paywall.
No paywall whatsoever. And before I even go into the paywall, I just wanted to add something to what Dan was saying, is that one of the with the New Bedford Light, we did a very good job early on at getting enthusiasm behind what we were doing. And I think because we truly were also very enthusiastic and very committed, and that was a big part of the message that we wanted to pass. But sustainability of, like, there's a lot of funders who are willing to help with seed money, but then don't seem quite as committed to help with the sustainability, right, of the model that was built. So that's always a conversation that we're having on our side as well. How do we convince and show and demonstrate value, right? How do we demonstrate the public good value, the impact of the journalism that we're doing, not just to our community, I mean, to the funders in our community and elsewhere, right? I think this goes both for community donors, but also for foundations, right? Is that there seems to be a lot of support to get started and not quite as much support to help you consolidate and deepen your structures, right? So moving on to the next question though, paywall, the New Bedford Light. I mean, we had this discussion in our early days before we even launched, and we came to the conclusion that no, we did not want a paywall under any circumstance, and we would not consider a paywall. And thus far, we haven't really needed to go back to that conversation in any potential way. But our position was that the paywall would contradict our mission, in that our mission is to enrich the civic culture, the social capital of New Bedford. And a lot of our city is, I mean, look at the median income in New Bedford. We did not want to create any sort of barrier to access of information. And we wanted that to be part of what we as a news organization were going to embody and represent in the city, that we wanted to reach everyone. So the paywall was completely contrary to that goal. And we decided as a group that we would do whatever it took, right, to try to avoid ever having to come to that moment in the conversation.
That's
Sorry.
actually, Sarabeth, I was going to ask you, do you draw the line on paywalls when you determine funding for different projects?
So we too have made a determination to fund organizations that do not have a paywall, and we've done it for a few reasons. One is the public service mission of feeling like we are in a fight right now for good information versus terrible information, and we need to make good information as easily accessible to audiences as bad information is. Two, on the business side, it is very inconclusive as to whether or not local paywall models work. In fact, there are very few examples of it working. And over the long term, there's some good evidence that shows that funders will, that readers will actually give more if they're asked to join as a public good rather than through a transactional relationship where you're weighing, do I want Netflix or do I want my subscription to the New Bedford Light? So what we're finding that we think it's a smart business model. It's aligned to the philanthropic rationale for investing in something. We think there's a huge need to inform and engage historically underrepresented audiences, and putting up a paywall is going to make that even harder. And finally, just generally, given the state of local news and the lack of journalism across the country, we want the barriers to getting journalism in the hands of communities as low as possible. That said, I think it is important for the field that there are news organizations experimenting with making the paywall model work. And so I am glad that there are organizations trying to make that work. And I think if it works, we can all learn from it. But we've made the decision to lean in on a no paywall model.
Thank you. Karen, what are you seeing in your world on paywalls?
I mean, there's a variety. We have over 400 members, but most of our members don't have a paywall, and the information is republished in over 700 different publications. So that's a lot of what INN members are offering. And, we vet all our organizations. We make sure that they cover a certain amount of public service journalism or investigative journalism. It's pretty rigorous. We make sure that who their donors are transparent, so we know that there's nothing shady going on there. And then they offer most of their journalism. Many of these organizations offer their journalism so that it might be republished, and it's an incredible win when a for-profit organization picks up a fabulous investigative reporting piece around education or civic topics, and are lifted within these for-profit organizations that have huge audiences.
Yeah. Can I offer a direct example of us doing that? You're
Yes.
absolutely
Yes,
right.
please. Yeah.
One of our first editor, Bobby Rossner, came from a more traditional model earlier on, right, during her career. And one of the things that I recall her saying over and over again was, wow, in this nonprofit model, we're not competitive about this. We're sharing, right? We are sharing this information. And that was great. And it really allows us to also project some of our stories that had national value into the national conversation and vice versa. But one of the things that we did early on was pitch an investigative story to ProPublica, and we ended up being selected by ProPublica. So we worked on this major story about our port in New Bedford and private equity influence in the fishing port that then reverberated through the entire industry. And ProPublica helped us pay for the reporter and for the work and for a lot of the legal work and investigation that went into that. And we wrote the story. It was still our story, but the projection, I mean, that type of collaboration was incredible. And we've repeated it a number of times, and we'll probably continue to repeat it. It is a win-win sort of situation. We did the same thing with the Marshall Project and ended up having a story published in Spanish, in English, and in El País, right? So it's very engaging, right? It's very active. It allows you to expand your local coverage and to project your city and the stories in your city to the national, even international conversation, and vice versa, right? Because it builds awareness that, hey, maybe what we're doing here is also quite important. We're not just a small city, in Southern Massachusetts. Not that I want to over romanticize this, but it helps build pride of place as well in a number of ways.
So
If I could make a point or two about that as well. It seems to me that with nonprofit status comes certain social obligations. There are tax advantages, and that one of the things that a nonprofit ought not to do is wall off their journalism from the public. But there are more creative ways of dealing with this than simply having a paywall. You can have the Colorado Sun, for instance, which was a for-profit public benefit corporation. It's in the process of going nonprofit, is completely free, but they have some premium newsletters that you have to become paid members to get access to. So that's kind of a way of having sort of a paywall, but nearly all of your journalism is available to the public. Another example that I wanted to mention is Montclair Local in New Jersey, which for a while, it's a nonprofit, had a completely free website, but you had to become a paying member to get their weekly print edition, which they would joke that was their tote bag. Unfortunately, they decided to get rid of the print edition, so I'm not sure they're offering any premium to their paid members at the moment. But there are ways of incentivizing becoming a paid member that I think are more creative than simply saying you must pay this.
We fund an organization called Block Club Chicago in Chicago, and they too have premium content that they've walled off, real estate content, and it's been a smart model.
it's such an interesting concept to me, the notion that a nonprofit has specific obligations because of its status, and that one of them is that journalism should be accessible to everybody. Do you not agree? I'm not looking to be argumentative here. It's just you kind of stand where you sit, and I come from the for-profit world, but isn't journalism itself a public service, and isn't the actual act of reading journalism, isn't it more important that we produce the journalism that could have an impact on a community?
Well, let me just jump in and point out that we're talking about a new movement that really grew out of a very old movement, and that's public television and public radio, which has always been free. And so these new organizations that we're talking about really are growing out of that earlier movement. And so I think that it would be odd to think that, okay, now we're going to start charging for journalism. And believe me, for profit, I'm totally for a paywall. I certainly remember that if you were going to open the news box, you first had to put in a quarter, and then a couple quarters, and then maybe 4 quarters. And that's the way it should be. But for profit and nonprofit are two different things.
I think
I mean,
it's
I
worth
can.
saying that journalism has to be paid for, nonprofit journalism has to be paid for, and not putting up a paywall is not an assumption that journalism doesn't need to be paid for. It's just a theory of the case on how to both serve the public mission and build the revenue streams that you need. Philanthropic dollars as a way, calling upon your readers to donate and to become members, and then finding earned revenue opportunities, which, by the way, are much easier if you grow your audience, which is much easier if you're not putting up walls to grow your audience. So for those reasons, we're seeing that business model perspective take hold, but it's all grounded in a very strong understanding that journalism has to be paid for.
Good, good. No, and I heard you loud and clear before talking about how effective paywalls might be at the very community level. That, we all accept that at a grand national / international level, the New York Times with, what did they just say they passed? 10 million subscribers and $1 billion in digital subscriber revenue, which is extraordinary.
And Marty Baron documented in his book that the very first strategic choice Jeff Bezos made was an understanding that the potential of the internet gives you scale. And so he took the Washington Post, which was a deeply local paper, and turned it into a national and a global paper. They're still finding their way on that business model, but the basic premise was definitely the right premise for the Washington Post, not for local news.
Yeah. Yeah, but as you know, that's not even working at the Washington Post right now. I mean,
Brian, I think something else that, people read the paper for local journalism, but they also read it for the coupons. They also read it for the comics. They also read it for the puzzles. So it was not simply a journalism product. It was a product with many things to engage. And what we're having this conversation about is those pieces, those engagement pieces have been broken off, and we are really trying to make sure that the core of journalism is still there for communities. And that's where the market has failed it. So that's what we're really trying to strengthen here.
These are great answers. And Daniela, I'll go back to you for a moment. You did some novel things in New Bedford, like carrying the daily fish prices, right? In the New Bedford Light.
A daily catch.
Which is another way of getting people involved and bringing in new audiences. Now, I was supposed to invite audience members to offer questions at the top of this. The problem is I've fallen in love with my own voice and I've largely ignored that. But there are questions that have come in, and I appreciate that. Daniela, one of them was, how much money did you have to kick off the New Bedford Light? Before you opened your website, what were the commitments to you and what did that allow you to do?
Not that much. We started basically with a group that had a lot of expertise. We were a very mixed group of people. I was the only person from academia, but the people who were part of the founding group that led to the creation of the New Bedford Light had been professionals, people dedicated to the city. We had a former editor of the Standard, 2 former editors of the Standard Times, now retired. We had a former mayor. We had some lawyers, right? So we had a lot of social capital, if you want, but not necessarily a lot of capital. But we also had people that had deep roots in the community and who knew where to go and seek that help. right? So I would say that our initial strategy to build was saying, hey, we're from here, we care about this place, we are serious players, we know what we're talking about, right? You can hopefully look at our backgrounds and trust us to launch this project, and then ask individuals who had the Rolodex, right, who knew who the potential donors could be, to start making phone calls, right? Literally start making phone calls to people and saying, hey, we're launching this project, would you be interested in helping to turn this idea into a reality? Right? So a lot of our initial money started trickling in like that, small donations of $500, $1,000, you know, but it added up to enough that we could hire freelancers and our columnist, Jack Spillane, who had been a top columnist in the city, continues to be the top columnist in the city, and had worked for the Standard Times also for most of his life. And then one of our founders managed to make the phone call that was very important to us in our first month. She found a donor, an anonymous donor, we don't know who this donor is still today, who was willing to put up a match of $100,000 if we could fundraise $100,000 in the community. And that basically was our seed money, those phone calls and this anonymous donor saying, hey, here's the money if you can get community buy-in, right? And that was also really important for us early on. I think looking back, I understand even more now how important that was beyond the money, just the idea that we had to go and get small dollar donations, right, to get us started. Got buy-in from the community as well very early on.
You want an example of how great the buy-in is for New Bedford Light? In the New York Times, when they ran this piece about the New Bedford Light launching, there's this fabulous quote, I don't have it exactly, but basically the mayor of New Bedford was like, it used to be that I couldn't even sneeze without being asked questions. And now I'm dying for people to show up at my press conferences. Like even the mayor had buy-in in wanting people to hold him accountable and ask him questions.
That's right. That's right. So what we found was that, the snowball effect was great. Our numbers are public, and I'm very proud of what we've achieved. It come with great labor and intense passion for the project. But in 2.5 years, we have managed to fundraise over $4 million.
Wow.
Yeah. And a lot of that money has come from New Bedford and the surrounding areas.
Congratulations, Daniela. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and we run a budget. We went from our first budget being a little over $500,000 for that year to now running a budget of $2 million, right? And then a newsroom. We have at least 19 full-time employees. Most of them are in our newsroom. So it's now our big question and our big mission is, okay, we grew, now we need to sustain this growth, right? We need to be able to make sure that this continues. But anyway, long story short, to come back to the question, and before I speak more than I should and prevent other people from speaking, we didn't start with a lot of money. What we did start with was a number of people who are already stakeholders in the community in some way, who are already recognized in the community, who came from different perspectives, right? Who all had this common understanding, but could also use their reputations to help bolster the idea into reality. And I think that was very important in that first stage, that people could see this is not outsiders coming in. These are people that have dedicated their work, their lives to New Bedford, in New Bedford. So they must mean it, right?
That's great, and it's inspirational. It ends up audience questions are better than my questions. Go figure. But let me go to a couple here, and that is, how are local news organizations getting people to actually read their stories and break through people's self and algorithm created social media news bubbles? How do you get people, Karen, Sarabeth, Dan? How do these places get people to actually pay attention to them?
I'll give a quick answer. I think in the last few years, news organizations have all realized that Facebook and whatever Twitter is these days and other social media are extremely unreliable partners for delivering local news. And so there's just been this huge emphasis on gathering email addresses and sending out newsletters. And people might feel that they're overwhelmed with newsletters, but a daily or weekly newsletter from your local news organization is something that you'll look at, and it doesn't depend on algorithms, and it's working very well for a lot of the startups.
Great.
I want to add
Oh, no,
Okay.
go for
Karen,
it.
please, Karen.
I just want to add as well too, there are some really exciting innovators using all sorts of different tools to really access audiences in new ways. There's an organization, Conecta Arizona, which is using WhatsApp. They're documented in New York is using WhatsApp. They're building communities there. They're sharing news and information there and having conversation with audiences, hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of people. There are also organizations, there's an organization in Detroit, Outlier Media, which has access to so many cell phone numbers, and they're able to text and have conversations directly with residents who need information. So people are doing innovative things to really access their audiences and communicate with them. It's journalism as service.
Thank you. Sarabeth, anything you want to add to that, or?
Echoing everything that was just said.
Great. Another question, what's your call to action for how regular everyday people can join this movement for independent local news startups?
That's a great question.
Become a member, make a small contribution? Where are we here?
Let me give you a small example. The Bedford Citizen, not the New Bedford Light, but the Bedford Citizen, began about a dozen years ago as a volunteer project. There were three women from the League of Women Voters who just started writing up the meetings they were going to anyway. And they did it without pay for a number of years. And then when you talk about people getting involved, there's a woman who lived in Bedford who works as a professional fundraiser, and she joined the board and put some of her ideas to work. And after a few years, the Bedford Citizen was pulling in enough money that they have a paid full-time editor, a paid half-time reporter, and paid freelance work. And this is really all as a result of a member of the community who decided she was going to get involved. And she had no journalism background, but she had some expertise she was able to provide. And it's taken the Bedford Citizen to a completely different level.
Great. Government money. Another question from the audience. Is there a role for it here?
Chime in on this.
It's another third rail, right?
So we are supporters of and on the steering committee of something called Rebuild Local News, which is a coalition of nonprofit and family-owned, locally owned news organizations trying to advocate for smart policy to help fund local news. Since the very beginnings of our country, we have had policy that helped enable the press. The postage was far cheaper for newspapers than it was for regular folks mailing, because the government understood we needed to get information out. We far underperform other developed democracies in terms of how much tax dollars we put into local news. We certainly don't want all of local news to be, or news in general, to be funded by government. That doesn't make sense. And it needs to be structured in smart ways that upholds editorial independence. But we do think there's a role for local news, for public dollars to go into local news. I'd encourage people to check out Rebuild Local News's website to look at the policies that they're recommending. But in general, I think the path forward to independence for these organizations is sustainable and diversified revenue. So that means diversified in terms of wanting some public dollars, but not all of your dollars to come from public from public dollars, wanting some philanthropic dollars, but not all of your dollars to come from philanthropic dollars, but also diversity within the number of funders that are funding you. The more diversity you have in terms of the funders, the more independent the journalism can be, because you're not beholden to any one line of revenue.
Is there a theoretical perfect formula for where revenue comes from in a nonprofit news organization at a community level? It used to be in for-profit news that, Dan, and you know this, 2/3 of the revenue would generally come in through advertising, and the bulk of that would actually be classified ads, a little, small ads or help wanted ads in the back of a mostly Sunday paper. 1/3 would come from subscribers. The successful ones have flipped that model where it's now 2/3 subscriber revenue, 1/3 ad revenue, and then the ad revenue will include events and other things like that. What is, anybody feel free to speak up here, but what is an ideal revenue scenario formula look like in a community nonprofit?
Oh, go ahead, Dan.
Oh, I was just going to say, you generally hear about a three-legged stool, with about 1/3 of it coming from high net worth individuals, which I understand is nonprofit speak for rich people, foundations, large philanthropies, things like that. 1/3 of it should come from member contributions in some way. And then the other 1/3 should come from earned income, which can be anything from an events business to advertising and sponsorships. The problem is that overwhelmingly, most of the nonprofits are more reliant on the large gifts and foundation money than they want to be. So they're trying to get that down and bring the other two legs up.
Karen, you agree with that?
I mean, look, that's sort of what the research says right now, but I think this model is still emerging. So I will, like I said, if you look at the INN index, it says that most of our members in local news have reduced how much foundation dollars they're bringing in. It's under 50%, 48%. So that's gone down significantly, but they're still really relying on grants right now. You know, we do operate a program called Newsmatch, and it does provide some fundraising support, but it's really dollars to help people leverage and go back and say, you know, Knight Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, all these foundations are part of Newsmatch, and they believe in my work. And then you go to individual donors and you say, join the Newsmatch program, donate to Newsmatch. So we really need to increase still individual donors, but that's where the numbers are right now.
Thank you. So look, we haven't talked about artificial intelligence in journalism. We haven't talked about objectivity and what that means now. Can we do that in 2 minutes? I don't think so. I will say a few weeks ago, we had an event here at BU in which we brought together founders of local nonprofits, community level nonprofits in the Massachusetts, really New England region, and held a little bit of a boot camp. We had speakers who were in fundraising, legal, audience development. I know INN did something very effective and similar at Shorenstein last year. Dan, I think you're doing something over at Northeastern if you haven't already. We expected a dozen people or so. We got well over 100. We had 125 people sign up. This is a huge movement, and it's an inspiring movement. It's really quite striking to see. How confident are you that this movement will be healthy in 5 years? Will it be healthier than it is now? Will it be not as healthy? Where are we going to be in 5 years on this? Anybody?
I do think we're going to be healthier in 5 years. I truly do believe that. But I will say this, there are a number of new entities popping up. And I think that part of it is really understanding you can't just decide I want to start a newsroom anymore without really understanding who your audience is going to be. Is there a market for it? Are you really serving this market? And you're going to have some business sense about it. You can't just cover something for the sake of covering it and hoping that philanthropy will come to you. It's a much more competitive and robust marketplace now. And there also are examples across the industry of different organizations, they're merging and consolidating. So there's some examples of that too. But I do think it will be healthier in 5 years.
Great, love to hear that. Sarabeth, anything to add there?
I think this is a generational shift we're undergoing. It took a generation to have this industry really unravel, and I think it's going to take a generation to rebuild it. So I think we're in the process of that. I'm very confident things will be much better in 5 years, and that's largely not because it will just happen, but because a lot of really good people are in it and doing it. There's dollars flowing in, and there's really smart minds and organizations trying to build it. So I'm confident we're going to feel much stronger about the state of nonprofit local news in particular 5 years from now.
Love that. I told you we would follow an arc and we would end on hope, and this is really, really a great thing. This is part of a series of, I think we call them COMTalks here, and this was a particularly important one. And you guys have been an amazing panel and inspirational. And BU thanks you for what you all do, and we thank you for participating in this panel. And we really are in an important moment in nonprofit news, and we're indebted to the hard work that all of you are doing on it. So thank you all, and thank you to our audience for participating in this. Questions were great, and we're really pleased you took the time. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.